we'll start with the prospectus. So you've identified several suitable publishers. In many cases, the prospectus is their first acquaintance with your project. So it's important that you put something together that's polished and thorough. And think of it, I like to think of it as an informational document, really, as well as a marketing document. You are trying to sell your project, essentially, to an editor and to a press. So in order to do that, you need to think about what are the pieces of information they need in order to evaluate whether your manuscript is a good fit for their list. And what that should include is a detailed abstract and chapter descriptions of your project. And I like this to run about 3 to 5 pages myself, with a table of contents, ideally one that's relatively detailed. Include also a sample chapter if you have it. I like the introduction, but really you know your work best, and you should choose the chapter that you feel best represents your work. Also include a rationale for the project. And what that might address is questions of the origins of the work. So in the case of, say, an edited collection, that project might have started in a conference. It's important to include those details, when the conference took place, and to talk a little bit about the evolution of the book collection out of the conference so that we have a sense of the trajectory of that project. In the case of a dissertation, you want to include where you did the dissertation, who was on the committee, also the revisions that you've undertaken. This is a very important step, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I address turning your dissertation into a book next. But it's important that the prospectus identify those points. And also a clear explanation of your methodology. Again, that's important for determining fit within a list. Prospectus should also identify your intended audience and also try to think about potential audiences for your project. So in some cases, it's very much a question of a niche audience, but in other cases, your project might have appeal to a wider trade audience. So it's important to think about who might be interested in reading your book, and I try to identify those groups to your publisher. You should include a description of the physical elements of the work. So that would include things like length, obviously, page or word count, but also the number of illustrations you'd like to include. Images can get complicated, so it's important to identify really early, and a publisher needs to have that information in order to evaluate whether a given project is feasible for them. Randy was talking about size and resources, so editors need to be able to realistically evaluate whether or not they can take on your project and do it in a way that it deserves to be done. So including, any illustrations, photographs, etc. is important. Identifying any issues surrounding permissions to reproduce those images is important. Also permissions to reprint any material that might have been published elsewhere. Many edited collections, many dissertations come to us where a chapter or two have been published in journals, so it's important to identify those areas. This can also have ramifications for funding, which Jonathan, I'm sure, will address later. So physical elements also include tables. So tables, appendices, any material that might need special design requirements, that sort of thing. Very important, a realistic schedule for completion. This can be an extremely difficult thing to assess when you're at the beginning of a project. Sometimes you're putting together a prospectus for a manuscript that's already completed, and it's easy to say, le voilà, there we go. But in many cases you're looking ahead, so it's important to be realistic about what your teaching load is, your research schedule, and as a publisher, I like to know when I can expect a project. It doesn't necessarily have to be right that moment, but I need to be able to schedule to look ahead and work out what's coming down the pipes in my list. Okay. Please include your curriculum vitae in a detailed one. I actually prefer the sort of long version to get a sense of your history as a scholar. And for dissertations, as I mentioned, a list or a description of the revisions that you intend to make or have already made. For edited collections, include a list of the contributors to that collection and their institutional affiliations, so we can have a sense of the scope of participants. This also has ramifications for funding. ASPP has requirements with regard to Canadian content, so we need to be able to evaluate that to decide whether or not your project is suitable for us. If you're making a proposal for a textbook, you really need to pay attention to the market and include an appraisal of the market. So doing a bit of market research yourself, include lists of courses that you feel your project would be suitable for. We would also ask that you identify any possible sources of funding or any potential funding issues, and in this case specifically, I like to know if a project isn't eligible for ASPP, the Aid to Scholarly Publishing Program, and sometimes that's a question of genre, sometimes that's a question of nationality, and Jonathan will say more about that as well. So once we have all of that information, we can spend some time trying to evaluate whether your project is a good match for us. Appraising a prospectus and manuscripts, but just the prospectus even, it requires considerable resources. We like to spend a considerable amount of time with a prospectus, and while you might send out your prospectus to a number of publishers, it's very important to be transparent about that process. Please tell everyone you are sending a prospectus to that it is under consideration at another publisher if you are doing multiple submissions. Certainly we ask, and I'm sure you guys probably do as well, that once you've decided to send your manuscript in whole to a publisher for review, that you are granting them the right of first refusal. So it's one shot at a time.